Monks have long been shrouded in mystery, often depicted as cloaked figures living in serene, isolated communities. But what was life really like for these men and women who dedicated their lives to faith? Today, we peel back the veil on monastic life, exploring the daily routines, spiritual practices, and survival strategies that define their existence. From prayer to manual labor, from solitude to community, we'll uncover the realities of a world far removed from our own. Imagine stepping into a medieval monastery, a place where time seemed to stand still. The air is filled with the scent of incense and the rhythmic sound of chanting. Outside, the world may be chaotic, but within the monastery walls, order reigns supreme. Yet, this life wasn't just about peace and tranquility. It was a rigorous, demanding existence that required immense discipline and sacrifice. So why did people choose this path? What drew them to leave behind the comforts of family and home for a life of poverty, obedience, and silence? And how did they survive in an era when even basic necessities were scarce? Join us as we delve into the secret lives of medieval monks, work, prayer, and survival. Medieval monks lived by a strict schedule that left little room for personal freedom. Their day was governed not by the clock, but by the rhythm of prayer and labor. From before dawn until long after sunset, every hour had a purpose. The day began in near silence, often before sunrise, with the first prayers of the day known as matins. Monks gathered in the cold, candlelit chapel, reciting psalms and hymns that echoed off stone walls. This was followed by lauds, a morning offering of praise that marked the official start of the day. After prayers, there was a short period of rest or study, depending on the monastery's rule. Some monks would retreat to their cells to read religious texts or copy manuscripts, preserving knowledge that might otherwise be lost. By mid-morning, manual labor began. Whether it was farming, brewing, gardening, or maintaining the monastery buildings, physical work was seen as both a necessity and a form of devotion. Meals were simple, usually bread, vegetables, and sometimes fish. Meat was avoided except in cases of illness. In the early afternoon came another round of communal prayer, prime, followed by more work until none, the final prayer before the main meal of the day. Evenings were dedicated to reflection and spiritual reading. After Vespers, the evening prayer, monks returned to their dormitories. Before sleep, they gathered one last time for Compline, a quiet, solemn service marking the end of the day. This cycle repeated every day, year-round, with only minor changes during feast days or special seasons like Lent. Prayer was the soul of monastic life, the thread that wove together every moment of a monk's day. It wasn't just a ritual. It was a duty, a discipline, and for many, a true spiritual calling. Monks followed a cycle of prayer known as the divine office, which divided the day into 8 specific times for worship. These weren't just quiet moments of reflection. They were structured services filled with psalms, hymns, readings, and chants. Every hour had its place in the rhythm of devotion. At the heart of this practice was the liturgy of the hours. Imagine waking before dawn to gather in cold, candlelit chapels, where the voices of dozens of monks rose in unison. They chanted the psalms, ancient songs that had been sung for centuries, their harmonies echoing off stone walls. This wasn't just about personal faith. It was seen as a sacred duty, a way to maintain divine order in a chaotic world. Each prayer was believed to bring balance not only to the soul, but to the entire cosmos. Monks were, in many ways, spiritual warriors, fighting through prayer to protect both themselves and the wider world. Silence was also sacred. Outside of official services, monks were expected to speak as little as possible. Conversations were limited, and even gestures were kept to a minimum. This silence wasn't just about obedience. It was a tool for inner reflection and humility. Some monasteries practiced mental prayer, a form of deep meditation or contemplation. Others emphasized lectio divina, the slow, reflective reading of Scripture. In these moments, monks sought not just to understand the words, but to feel God's presence within them. The goal was simple, yet profound, to live constantly in the awareness of God. To turn every action, whether copying a manuscript, tending a garden, or eating a meal, into an act of worship. And so, through the cold hours of the night and the warmth of midday sun, the prayers continued. Not for glory, not for reward, but because for a medieval monk, there was no life without prayer. Monastic life wasn't all prayer and silence. A great deal of time was spent in physical labor. Far from being isolated from the world, monks played a crucial role in sustaining their communities through agriculture, craftsmanship, and preservation of knowledge. Every monastery was essentially a self-sufficient village. Fields had to be plowed, crops harvested, animals tended, and buildings maintained. Some monasteries even ran breweries, producing beer not just for their own use, but also for trade with nearby towns. In the fields, monks worked side by side with lay brothers, non-clergy who lived within the monastery and shared in its duties. They grew grains, vegetables, and medicinal herbs. They raised livestock, managed orchards, and cultivated vineyards. Many of Europe's most famous wine regions began as monastic estates. Inside the monastery walls, skilled monks crafted tools, repaired books, and built everything from furniture to fortifications. In scriptoriums, they meticulously copied ancient texts by hand, preserving literature, philosophy, and religious writings that might have otherwise been lost. But it wasn't just about survival or scholarship. Labor was seen as a form of worship, a way to serve God through service to others. Saint Benedict's rule famously stated, "Ora et labora," pray and work. Monks also provided essential services to the surrounding communities. They ran hospitals and hospices, offering shelter to travelers and care for the sick. Some monasteries became centers of learning, where local children were taught reading, writing, and arithmetic. This dedication to work made monasteries some of the most stable and productive institutions of the Middle Ages. While kingdoms rose and fell, wars raged, and famine swept across the land, monastic communities remained quiet, steadfast, and deeply connected to the world outside their walls. Forget grand feasts and golden goblets. For most medieval monks, food was simple, repetitive, and often bland. But it wasn't just about survival. It was a form of discipline, humility, and spiritual practice. Monks followed strict dietary rules based on a monastic order. The Benedictines, one of the largest orders, ate only one meal a day during much of the year, and even that was carefully controlled. Meat was rarely allowed, except for the sick or elderly. Fish appeared more often, especially on fasting days. Otherwise, the diet revolved around bread, vegetables, legumes, cheese, eggs, and whatever could be grown in a monastery garden. Bread was the staple, dense, dark, and made from rye or barley. Unlike today's loaves, medieval bread was tough and filling, sometimes filled with grit from the grinding stones. Cheese was often soft and unpasteurized, while eggs came from chickens or ducks raised within the monastery grounds. Vegetables like onions, leeks, cabbage, and turnips were common, along with herbs such as parsley, sage, and thyme used to add flavor. Fruits were seasonal: apples, pears, figs, and often dried for winter use. But what monks lacked in variety, they made up for in routine. Meals were eaten in silence, often while listening to a brother read aloud for religious texts. This wasn't just about quiet reflection. It ensured no unnecessary conversation took place. Water was avoided due to contamination, so instead, monks drank ale, weak, low-alcohol beer brewed daily in nearly every monastery. Some monasteries became famous for their brewing skills, laying the foundation for some of Europe's oldest beer traditions. Fasting was a regular part of monastic life. Wednesdays, Fridays, and entire seasons like Lent were dedicated to abstinence from animal products. During these times, meals became even more minimal: porridge, bread soaked in water or vinegar, and boiled grains. Despite the simplicity, food was never wasted. Leftovers were given to the poor or fed to animals. Every crumb had a purpose, and every meal was seen as a gift from God. So while modern eyes might see this as deprivation, for the medieval monk, it was a way of life, one built on restraint, gratitude, and spiritual devotion. Monastic life was built on discipline, not just spiritual devotion, but ironclad rules that governed every moment of a monk's day. These were not suggestions or guidelines. They were laws of survival in a world where self-control meant everything. The foundation of monastic discipline came from the rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century. It became the blueprint for countless monasteries across Europe. Its core principles were simple yet demanding: obedience, stability, and conversion of manners. In other words, monks were expected to obey their superiors without question, remain in the same monastery for life, and constantly strive for moral and spiritual improvement. Silence was one of the most powerful tools of discipline. Monks were forbidden from speaking during meals, prayers, and much of their daily work. Conversations were limited to what was absolutely necessary, and even then, they were kept brief and respectful. Some monasteries used hand signals or wax tablets to communicate silently. This silence wasn't about isolation. It was about cultivating inner peace and avoiding distractions. Punishments for breaking the rules could be harsh. A monk who spoke out of turn might be excluded from communal meals or forced to eat alone. Repeated offenses could lead to public penance, kneeling in the chapel for hours, reciting psalms without pause, or even corporal punishment. While physical beatings were rare in many orders, they were not unheard of, especially in stricter communities. Even small comforts were considered dangerous. Monks slept in shared dormitories with minimal bedding, often just a straw mattress and a single blanket. They wore the same rough woolen robes year-round, with no personal possessions beyond what was provided by the monastery. Personal grooming was limited. Many monks shaved their heads in a ritual known as the tonsure, symbolizing humility and detachment from vanity. Fasting was another pillar of monastic discipline. Certain days required complete abstinence from food, while others restricted diet to bread, water, and vegetables. During Lent, meals were reduced even further, and all forms of animal products were banned. These fasts weren't symbolic. They were physically grueling, designed to weaken the body so the spirit could grow stronger. But perhaps the greatest test of discipline was the constant self-monitoring. Every action, from how you held your hands in prayer to how you ate your meal, had a prescribed form. Monks were expected to confess their faults regularly and submit completely to the authority of the abbot. There was no room for ego, ambition, or rebellion. This rigid structure may seem oppressive by today's standards, but for medieval monks, it was a path to holiness, a way to live not for oneself, but for God. A monastery was more than just a place of prayer. It was a self-contained world, governed by strict hierarchy and built around shared purpose. Every man who entered its walls became part of a tightly knit community, where roles were clearly defined and every task had meaning. At the top stood the abbot, the spiritual and administrative leader. Elected by the monks, he held near absolute authority over daily life. His word was law, and disobedience was not tolerated. Beneath him were the prior and sub-prior, who managed the day-to-day affairs of the monastery and acted in the abbot's absence. Most of the community consisted of monks, fully professed brothers who lived under the rule of Saint Benedict or whatever order they belonged to. These men performed the majority of the work, from prayer and teaching to farming and manuscript copying. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, surrendering all personal possessions and ambitions upon entry. Below them were the lay brothers, often older men or those with limited education. While they followed the same monastic rule, they were not expected to participate in choir services or scholarly pursuits. Instead, they handled physical labor, tending animals, working the fields, and maintaining buildings. Then there were the novices, young men considering a lifelong commitment to monastic life. Before taking their final vows, they underwent years of training, learning Latin, theology, and the routines of monastic discipline. Some came willingly. Others were sent by noble families who could no longer afford to support them, or saw monastic life as a suitable path for younger sons who would never inherit land. Even within this structured world, some monks found unique roles. The celler oversaw food storage and distribution. The infirmarian cared for the sick. The almoner distributed charity to the poor outside the monastery walls. And the porter guarded the entrance, ensuring that only those with proper cause entered. Life inside the monastery was communal, but not without tension. Personal space was nearly non-existent. Monks slept in shared dormitories, ate at long tables, and worked side by side. Conflicts arose, but silence and obedience were enforced to maintain harmony. Despite the rigid structure, these communities thrived for centuries. They were places of refuge, learning, and service, offering stability in an unpredictable world. In a world where most people couldn't read or write, monks were the keepers of knowledge, quiet scholars preserving wisdom in candlelit scriptoriums while empires rose and fell outside their walls. Education in medieval Europe was rare. For the average peasant, literacy meant recognizing basic religious symbols. But inside monasteries, learning was not only valued, it was required. Monks were expected to study scripture, theology, Latin, and sometimes even philosophy and science. The heart of this intellectual life was the scriptorium, a room dedicated to copying manuscripts by hand. Here, monks worked for hours each day, carefully transcribing ancient texts on a parchment made from animal skin. With no printing presses or typewriters, every book had to be written word by word, letter by letter. These weren't just Bibles and prayer books. Monks copied works of Roman and Greek philosophers, Aristotle, Cicero, Virgil, ensuring that knowledge survived the collapse of classical civilizations. Without them, many of these texts might have been lost forever. Monastic schools also played a crucial role in educating future clergy and even some nobles. These schools taught Latin grammar, arithmetic, music, and rhetoric, the 7 liberal arts that formed the basis of medieval education. Some monasteries even trained boys from wealthy families, offering them a path into the church or government service. But education wasn't just about reading and writing. It was also about discipline, memorization, and spiritual reflection. Learning was seen as a form of devotion, a way to understand God's creation through study and contemplation. Some monasteries became centers of innovation. In Ireland and Scotland, monks developed new styles of calligraphy and illustration, creating stunningly detailed manuscripts like the Book of Kells. In Italy and France, others experimented with early forms of musical notation, laying the foundation for Western music. Despite their isolation, monks were deeply connected to the wider world. They corresponded with other monasteries, shared ideas, and even advised kings and bishops on matters of faith and governance. Through wars, plagues, and political chaos, monasteries remained islands of learning, places where knowledge was protected, studied, and passed down through generations. So while the rest of Europe lived in ignorance, monks quietly turned pages, preserving the light of knowledge in a dark age. In a world without modern medicine, medieval monks faced constant threats to their health, from disease and injury to malnutrition and exhaustion. Their bodies bore the weight of a life lived in austerity, where illness was often seen not as a medical issue, but as a spiritual test. Monastic infirmaries were the closest thing to hospitals that most people had access to. These rooms housed the sick and elderly, offering care based on herbal remedies, prayer, and rest. Monks believed that suffering could bring one closer to God, so illness wasn't always seen as something to be cured. Sometimes it was meant to be endured. But despite their devotion, monks still sought ways to treat ailments. They cultivated medicinal gardens filled with herbs like sage, rosemary, thyme, and fennel. These plants were used to make teas, poultices, and salve for everything from fevers to wounds. Some monasteries even kept medical manuscripts detailing treatments passed down through generations. Still, many diseases ran rampant. Tuberculosis, dysentery, and scurvy were common due to poor diet and unsanitary conditions. Without understanding germs or infection, monks relied on outdated practices like bloodletting and purging to balance the humors. Injuries from manual labor or accidents were often fatal, especially when infections set in. Hygiene was another challenge. While some monasteries maintained basic cleanliness, bathing was rare. Many believed water opened the pores to disease. Instead, monks wiped themselves with wool cloths or changed clothes infrequently. Lice and fleas were a constant nuisance, thriving in the thick woolen robes worn year-round. Despite these hardships, monks found strength in community. When one fell ill, others prayed for him. When pain became unbearable, silence was his only complaint. Their lives were not easy, but they were lived with purpose, even in the face of suffering. Monasteries were not just places of prayer. They were entire worlds built in stone, designed to support a life of devotion, discipline, and community. Every room had a purpose. Every corridor led somewhere meaningful, and the architecture itself reflected the values of monastic life. At the heart of every monastery stood the church, or abbey, often the largest and most elaborate building. It was here that monks gathered for daily prayers, chanting psalms in Latin before towering stained glass windows that filtered sunlight into sacred colors. The church wasn't just a spiritual center. It was the emotional core of monastic life. Surrounding the church was the cloister, a covered walkway enclosing a peaceful courtyard garden. This space was more than decorative. It provided fresh herbs, vegetables, and a place for quiet reflection. Here, monks could walk in silence, meditate, or read scripture without distraction. Next to the cloister lay the scriptorium, where monks spent hours copying manuscripts by hand. These rooms were carefully lit with candles and narrow windows to protect delicate parchment from sunlight. Some scriptoria were communal, others individual, but all were places of intense focus and dedication to preserving knowledge. The dormitory was where monks slept, usually in long, shared halls with minimal furnishings. Stone beds or wooden frames held straw mattresses, and each monk had little personal space. Silence reigned even at night, broken only by the occasional cough or rustle of wool robes. Monks ate in the refectory, a large hall lined with long wooden tables. Meals were taken in near silence, while one monk read aloud from religious texts. At one end stood a raised platform where the abbot and senior monks dined, reinforcing the hierarchy within the order. The kitchen and bakery were essential to daily survival. Here, monks prepared simple meals, bread, porridge, vegetables, and occasionally fish. Large hearths burned constantly, and iron pots hung ready for cooking. Smoke filled the air, mingling with the scent of rising dough and boiling stew. A chapter house served as a meeting room where monks gathered daily to discuss monastery affairs, confess faults, and receive instructions from the abbot. Decisions were made collectively, though final authority always rested with the abbot. Outside, the monastic farm and gardens sustained the community. Fields stretched beyond the walls, where crops were grown and animals raised. Herb gardens provided medicine, while orchards offered fruit. Water systems like wells and aqueducts brought fresh water to the kitchens and baths. Every part of the monastery was built with purpose, not luxury, but function. These were not palaces, but sanctuaries, places where monks lived not for themselves, but for God and the preservation of faith and knowledge. Despite their secluded lives behind monastery walls, monks were not entirely cut off from the world. In fact, they played a vital role in medieval society, offering aid, education, and spiritual guidance to those beyond their cloisters. Monasteries were often located near towns or along major trade routes, making them natural centers for charity and hospitality. Travelers, pilgrims, and the poor could find shelter, food, and medical care within their gates. Some monasteries even maintained guest houses specifically for visitors, providing beds, meals, and protection in an age when roads were dangerous and inns were scarce. The almoner, one of the key roles within a monastery, was responsible for distributing charity. He would hand out bread, soup, and clothing to the needy, sometimes even offering small amounts of money or tools to help people get back on their feet. This wasn't just about kindness. It was seen as a direct act of service to God. Many monks believed that helping the poor was a way to earn divine favor. But monks didn't only give, they also received. Monasteries relied heavily on donations from nobles and wealthy patrons who sought spiritual merit by funding religious institutions. These gifts could include land, livestock, or gold, allowing monasteries to grow into powerful economic centers. Monks also acted as advisors and educators. Kings and bishops frequently turned to learn monks for counsel, especially in matters of theology, law, and diplomacy. Some monks even served as scribes in royal courts, drafting official documents and treaties. In times of crisis, such as famine or plague, monasteries became lifelines for local communities. They opened their granaries, cared for the sick, and preserved order when secular authorities failed. During outbreaks of disease, monks often stayed behind to tend to the ill, risking their own lives in the name of faith. Yet this connection with the outside world was not without its dangers. Disease could spread from visiting travelers, and political conflicts sometimes brought violence to monastery doors. Some monasteries were attacked during wars or raids, their wealth making them tempting targets. Still, monks remained committed to their mission, not just as men of prayer, but as healers, teachers, and protectors of the weak. Their influence reached far beyond their cloistered halls, shaping the very fabric of medieval life. When we think of monks, we often imagine a single type, robed figures chanting in stone halls, copying manuscripts by candlelight. But medieval monasticism was far from uniform. Across Europe, dozens of religious orders emerged, each with its own rules, traditions, and purpose. The Benedictines, founded by Saint Benedict in the 6th century, were among the oldest and most influential. Their rule emphasized stability, obedience, and a balance between prayer and labor. Benedictine monks lived in large abbeys, following a strict daily schedule of worship, study, and physical work. Many of these monasteries became centers of learning and agriculture, shaping the cultural and economic life of medieval Europe. In contrast, the Cistercians, founded in the late 11th century as a reform movement, sought to return to a stricter interpretation of the Benedictine rule. They rejected luxury, lived in remote locations, and embraced a life of simplicity and self-sufficiency. Cistercian monasteries were known for their architectural innovations and pioneering agricultural techniques, including water-powered mills and extensive vineyards. Then there were the Carthusians, who took monastic isolation to an extreme. Founded in 1084, this order emphasized silence and solitude. Carthusian monks lived alone in small cells arranged around a cloister, only gathering for weekly Massachusetts. Unlike other orders, they had no communal refectory or dormitory. Every meal was taken in private, and personal interaction was minimal. The Franciscans, established in the early 13th century by Saint Francis of Assisi, broke away from traditional monastic seclusion. These friars lived among the people, preaching, helping the poor, and renouncing all personal possessions. They wore simple brown robes and walked barefoot, dedicating their lives to poverty and service rather than manuscript copying or farming. Similarly, the Dominicans, founded by Saint Dominic around the same time, focused on education and combating heresy. Dominican friars were scholars and preachers, trained in theology and philosophy. They played a key role in running universities and engaging in theological debates, often serving as advisors to kings and popes. There were also military orders, such as the Knights Templar and Hospitallers, which combined monastic discipline with armed service. Originally formed during the Crusades, these orders protected Christian pilgrims and fought in battles while still adhering to monastic vows. They followed a strict rule, lived communally, and even wore distinctive robes marked with crosses. Each order had its own dress code, dietary restrictions, and spiritual focus. Some emphasized manual labor, others intellectual pursuits, and still others complete withdrawal from the world. But all shared a common goal: to live a life dedicated to God, whether behind monastery walls or in the heart of bustling cities. This diversity allowed monasticism to adapt to different needs and challenges across centuries. Whether preserving knowledge, feeding the hungry, or defending the faith, monks found many ways to serve, each order offering a unique path to holiness. While monks often dominate the image of medieval religious life, women played an equally vital role, not just as nuns, but as scholars, healers, and spiritual leaders within their own monastic communities. Monastic life for women was no less rigorous than it was for men. Nunneries followed strict rules similar to those of male monasteries, emphasizing prayer, silence, obedience, and manual labor. Like monks, nuns lived under vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, dedicating their lives to God and communal service. The rule of Saint Benedict, which guided most monastic communities, applied equally to women's houses. Nuns rose early, attended daily prayers, and spent long hours in work that ranged from copying manuscripts to tending gardens and caring for the sick. Some nunneries became known for their medical knowledge, running infirmaries that served both their own members and nearby villagers. Despite their devotion, nunneries often faced more scrutiny than male monasteries. Many were founded by noble women seeking spiritual refuge or political protection. In some cases, daughters of kings and lords were sent to nunneries not out of personal calling, but as part of family strategy to avoid marriage alliances or secure divine favor. Some women found leadership roles within these communities. Abbesses held significant authority, sometimes even overseeing male clergy in their regions. One famous example is Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th-century Benedictine nun who became a renowned composer, writer, and mystic. She corresponded with popes and kings, wrote theological treatises, and composed music still performed today. Nunneries also provided rare educational opportunities for women. While most girls in medieval Europe had little access to formal schooling, nuns often learned Latin, theology, and basic literacy. Some nunneries maintained libraries and scriptoriums where women copied texts, preserving knowledge otherwise inaccessible to them. But life wasn't easy. Nunneries were frequently underfunded compared to male monasteries. They relied on donations and land grants, which could be inconsistent. Without strong patronage, many struggled with poverty, disease, and external threats. In times of war or political instability, nunneries were especially vulnerable. Unlike fortified male monasteries, they often lacked protection and were at risk of attack, forced closures, or exploitation. Some abbesses had to negotiate directly with local lords or bishops to maintain independence and security. Still, despite these challenges, women in religious life carved out spaces where they could lead, learn, and serve. Their contributions in medicine, education, literature, and faith helped shape the spiritual and intellectual landscape of the Middle Ages. So while history often overlooks them, the silent strength of medieval nuns left a lasting mark. One prayer, one manuscript, and one act of charity at a time. For medieval monks, spirituality wasn't just a part of life. It was life. Every action, every word, and even every silence was shaped by the pursuit of divine understanding. Theirs was not a path of casual faith, but one of total surrender to God, to the rule, and to the search for inner transformation. At the heart of monastic spirituality was the belief that true enlightenment came through humility, self-discipline, and constant awareness of God's presence. Unlike knights who sought glory in battle or nobles who chased power, monks found their purpose in renunciation, giving up wealth, family, and personal freedom in exchange for a deeper connection with the divine. Some monks pursued what was known as contemplative prayer, a form of deep meditation where they sought to quiet the mind and open the soul to God's voice. This wasn't about reciting set prayers. It was about entering into a direct, intimate relationship with the sacred. In these moments, monks believed they could glimpse the eternal, if only for a fleeting second. Others followed the practice of lectio divina, or divine reading. This was more than studying scripture. It was a slow, meditative process where monks read a passage, then reflected on its meaning, prayed over it, and finally allowed it to sink into their hearts in silent contemplation. The goal was not just to understand the words, but to be transformed by them. Mysticism also played a role in monastic life. Some monks experienced visions, trances, or ecstatic states that they interpreted as signs of divine favor. Figures like Meister Eckhart and Saint Bernard of Clairvaux wrote extensively on the union between the soul and God, describing a state where the self dissolved into pure love and light. But this path was not easy. Many monks struggled with doubt, fear, and spiritual dryness. Long hours of prayer could feel empty. Silence could become oppressive. Faith could waver under the weight of hardship. Yet, they continued, believing that true holiness was not found in emotion, but in perseverance. Fasting and self-denial were seen as tools to purify the body so the spirit could shine. By denying physical comfort, monks believed they could sharpen their focus on the unseen world. Some took this to extremes, sleeping on stone floors, wearing rough garments, or even practicing forms of self-punishment to remind themselves of human frailty. Despite their isolation, monks saw themselves as warriors, not of swords but of prayer. They believed that their daily worship helped protect the world from evil, that their sacrifices contributed to the salvation of souls, and that their lives were part of a cosmic struggle between light and darkness. Through centuries of candlelit vigils, whispered psalms, and silent contemplation, monks kept searching, not for answers, but for something beyond them, something eternal. Life in the Middle Ages was a constant battle against hardship, whether from famine, disease, war, or economic struggle. For monks, survival meant not just enduring these challenges, but adapting with ingenuity and faith. When crops failed due to harsh weather or poor harvests, monasteries had to find ways to stretch their food supplies. Some developed sophisticated grain storage systems, using underground silos to keep wheat dry and safe from pests. Others bred hardy livestock that could survive on sparse vegetation, ensuring at least some food remained available through the winter months. Disease was an ever-present threat. Without modern medicine, monks relied on herbal remedies passed down through generations. Monastic infirmaries kept stores of medicinal herbs like sage, rosemary, and fennel, used to treat everything from fevers to digestive issues. When plague struck nearby villages, monasteries sometimes quarantined themselves, sealing off parts of the monastery to prevent infection. War brought its own dangers. Monasteries were often targeted by raiders for their wealth and supplies. In response, some built fortified walls and watchtowers. Others negotiated with local lords for protection, offering spiritual services in exchange for armed defense. A few orders even took up arms themselves, forming warrior monks who defended their communities while still following religious vows. Harsh winters tested both body and spirit. With no central heating, monks layered woolen robes and huddled together during long nights. They burned peat bricks and dried dung for warmth, though smoke filled their quarters. Some monasteries built underfloor heating systems known as hypocausts, an innovation borrowed from ancient Roman architecture. Economic hardship came when trade routes were disrupted or donations from noble patrons dried up. To sustain themselves, many monasteries expanded their industries. They brewed beer for sale, produced cheese, raised bees for honey, and made candles from tallow. These goods were traded in nearby towns, bringing in much-needed income. Despite all this, monks believed suffering had purpose. Pain was seen as a test of faith, a way to purify the soul and grow closer to God. Whether fasting, enduring illness, or facing poverty, they saw hardship not as something to be avoided, but as a path to holiness. Through centuries of crisis, monasteries endured. Not because life was easy, but because monks found ways to adapt, survive, and continue their mission. Monastic life may seem like a relic of the past, but its influence still shapes the world we live in today. From education and medicine to architecture and agriculture, monks left behind a legacy that continues to touch modern society in ways most people never realize. One of the most enduring contributions of monasticism was in preserving knowledge. In an age when literacy was rare and books were priceless, monks worked tirelessly to copy ancient texts by hand. Without their dedication, many works of Greek philosophy, Roman law, and early Christian theology might have been lost forever. The libraries they built became the foundation for later universities and centers of learning across Europe. Monks also played a key role in the development of modern education. Many of today's oldest schools and universities trace their roots back to monastic institutions. Monastic schools taught Latin, grammar, music, and arithmetic, laying the groundwork for formal education systems. Some orders, like the Benedictines and Dominicans, continue to run schools and universities worldwide. In medicine, monks were among the first to provide organized care for the sick. They ran infirmaries, experimented with herbal remedies, and documented treatments that would later evolve into modern pharmacology. Many of the earliest hospitals in Europe were founded by religious orders, institutions that still operate today under names like St. Vincent's or St. Mary's. The agricultural revolution owes much to monastic innovation. Cistercian monks, in particular, pioneered new farming techniques, including crop rotation, water-powered mills, and selective breeding of livestock. These advancements helped increase food production and sustain growing populations, changes that paved the way for the economic rise of medieval Europe. Even winemaking and brewing, now global industries, were shaped by monks. Benedictine and Cistercian monasteries developed some of the finest vineyards in France and Germany, perfecting winemaking methods still used today. Trappist monks created beer recipes that remain highly valued, with some breweries continuing to use centuries-old formulas. Monastic influence can also be seen in architecture and urban planning. Many of Europe's great cathedrals, abbeys, and town halls were built using techniques refined in monastic workshops. The layout of medieval towns often revolved around monasteries, which acted as centers of trade, governance, and charity. Beyond physical structures, monks helped shape moral and ethical thought. Their emphasis on humility, service, and self-discipline influenced Western ideals of duty and responsibility. Concepts like charity, hospitality, and social welfare find deep roots in monastic traditions. Today, while fewer people choose the monastic path, the values it promoted, discipline, contemplation, and service, continue to inspire individuals and communities around the world. Whether through silent retreats, mindfulness practices, or charitable organizations, the spirit of monasticism lives on, quietly shaping the modern world from behind the scenes. Monastic life was not for the faint of heart. It demanded sacrifice, discipline, and a level of devotion that few would willingly choose today. Yet, despite its hardships, it endured for centuries, shaping the spiritual, intellectual, and cultural fabric of medieval Europe. What makes monastic life so fascinating is not just its rigidity or isolation, but the deep sense of purpose it offered. For monks, every moment had meaning. Every task, whether copying a manuscript, tending a garden, or kneeling in silent prayer, was an act of worship. Their lives were not driven by wealth, power, or ambition, but by faith and service. In many ways, monasticism was a refuge from the chaos of the outside world. While kingdoms rose and fell, wars raged, and plagues swept through cities, monasteries remained steady, places where knowledge was preserved, the sick were cared for, and time moved to the rhythm of prayer rather than politics. Yet, even within this structured world, there was room for individuality. Some monks became great scholars, others healers, and some mystics who claimed to experience divine visions. Each man found his own path within the same rule, guided by the same principles, but shaped by personal struggle and revelation. Today, monastic life may seem distant, a relic of a forgotten age, but its values still resonate. In a world of constant distraction, the monk's silence calls to us. In an age of excess, their simplicity offers clarity. And in a time of uncertainty, their unwavering dedication reminds us of the power of conviction. So why does monastic life still captivate us? Perhaps because it represents something we all long for, a life with meaning, purpose, and peace amidst the noise. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. If you want to see more videos like this one, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next journey into history's hidden corners. Until next time, keep wondering what lies beyond the walls of the past.